Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the virtual Polish Institute of International Affairs. I'm not sure if the banner behind me is visible well enough, but it does say the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And welcome to this seminar on Muslim communities in Europe and the United States and their response to the pandemic. My name is Patrycja Sasnal. I'm the head of research at PISM, but I also cover Islamic issues, religious affairs, and the Middle East at the Institute. And to talk about this topic of our seminar, we have a dream panel, I have to say, with us, which consists of Dr. Amani El-Jak and Dr. Yasmin El-Menwar. Amani is connecting from Boston, the United States, and Yasmin is connecting from, I'm not sure, Bielefeld, Yasmin?
Bielefeld, yes.
Bielefeld, Germany, and I'm in Warsaw, Poland. So welcome once again. I will briefly present the panelists to you so that you know who's talking about the issues of the Muslim community's response to the pandemic, and we'll explain a little bit why we are doing this. Amani El-Jak, Dr. Amani El-Jak, she is Associate Professor and incoming Chair of Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies at the College of Liberal Arts at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She's also affiliate faculty there in the PhD program in Global Governance and Human Security at the McCormick Graduate School. She was Associate Professor and Research Coordinator of Social Issues at the Gulf Studies Center at the Qatar University, which is where we met. Dr. El-Jak's research and teaching traverse socioeconomic, political and cultural interrogation of the gendered fields of transnational migration, globalization, militarization and war and post-conflict reconstruction processes in Africa and the Middle East. And if it's not finished, for sure I know that you have worked on a book manuscript on the Arab Spring and Islamic revivalism. Welcome, Amani. And Dr. Yasmin El-Menwar, she is a senior expert for Islam in Europe and religious diversity at the Bertelsmann Stiftung. She is the head of the Religion Monitor Project at Bertelsmann, which is, the project is addressing challenges and chances of the growing cultural and religious diversity in European societies. Yasmin is also, and has been an associate fellow at DGAP in Germany. She has previously taught courses on social integration, religious minorities and migration at the University of Düsseldorf. And Dr. El-Menwar also worked at the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, where she conducted research projects for the Deutsche Islam Conference. She studied sociology and Islamic studies, holds a PhD in social sciences. Welcome, Yasmin.
Thank you.
I will try to moderate our conversation and ask you questions about the Muslim communities in Europe and the US, but I just want to explain that we're focusing on those communities because it's an example of a minority community in Europe and the US that needs to cope with the pandemic. So we wondered while devising this meeting today, we were wondering if there are specific qualities, specific experiences of minority groups in the pandemic. Just yesterday night, we heard from Saudi Arabia, for example, that they are going to drastically curtail the pilgrimage due to the coronavirus pandemic. And when we say that, for someone not familiar with Islam, I think it may sound, okay, then I can't go, or a Muslim can't go for Hajj to Saudi Arabia. But it's so much more than this, because the Hajj is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's an obligation for a Muslim. There are people who have been saving money for years just to go for pilgrimage to Mecca. And it was supposed to happen just now, and it will not. So we are talking about some 2.5 million people every year that go for the pilgrimage. And this is just an example of a really a big obstacle in life all of a sudden for someone who is Muslim and wanted to go or was planning to go there. So that apart, I would like to start our conversation with maybe two introductions from both of you. Amani, about the situation of Muslims in the US, and Yasmin, the same in Europe, although I imagine you'll be focusing on Germany specifically. Amani, can we start with you and the United States? Also, you know, in the context of what's happening in terms of racial relations and the kind of situation that we have been witnessing since the murder of George Floyd.
So let me thank you, Patricia, for the invitation. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. When it comes to the COVID pandemic and Muslim communities, let me start by just outlining two problematics, and then I will answer your question. We often tend to homogenize and also victimize. And homogenize in a sense that we assume that all Muslim communities in the US experience the COVID pandemic the same way. And it really varies from one community to another, based on the race and ethnicity, as you mentioned in your question about the experiences of particularly Black Muslim, African American Muslims in the US. And COVID has impacted them in a very kind of disproportionate and multi-layered way, in a way that they have historically experienced certain kind of inequities within the US in terms of their access to housing, their access to healthcare and health resources. Poverty level among African American Muslims are very large, disproportionately so in comparison with Muslims who are coming from other parts of the globe. So, but the current situation in the US and particularly has worsened during the Trump administration, racist and xenophobic policies, particularly towards Muslim communities. So I am to some extent encouraged by the grassroots movements, which include a coalition of different kind of minority groups within the US, and that includes some of the Muslim communities. And really many of these grassroots groups are now calling for systemic changes to US, to the American ways of dealing with these different religious and different communities in a way that it will enable them to combat some of these kind of systematic prejudices and kind of and discrimination. But there is a kind of a very large group of Black American as well as Muslim community, as well as Muslim communities who are coming from Africa, West Africa, North Africa, and the Middle East, from Asia, from other parts of the globe. The experience is really varied. That's why I just caution from homogenizing the Muslim communities as one kind of group, because the experiences vary from one community to another within the certain group, and it also varies from one group to another.
Can I just ask real quick, because you're giving us this notion of heterogeneity within the Muslim community in the US, but so specifically the impact of the pandemic, if you could explain how we can characterize it or how it differs, how it's specific.
All right. So, for example, if we talk about Muslim immigrants community who constitute the majority of the Muslim communities within the US, we find that many of these immigrants communities, particularly those who are coming from the Middle East, North Africa, or those who are coming from South Asia, Pakistani, Irani, Bangladeshi communities, we find that in terms of their heterogeneity, we find a large number of them are at the front lines of combating the pandemics as medical doctors, as nurses, as those who are associated with some of the essential services. And they have contributed to kind of improving those who are infected with the corona pandemic's life at different levels, right? But even within that same communities, we still find people who are disproportionately kind of impacted at the economic or education or socioeconomic level. We find a large number of them, both men and women, work in nursing houses, work in kind of meat packing facilities. And that also exposes them at a very larger kind of rate in comparison with the rest of the population. So it really depends on their relational positionality to the COVID pandemic itself. Some are contributing and really significantly contributing in positive ways, but some of them are like adversely and in a very negative ways, like constitute a large number of the casualties in terms of deaths, but also infections.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yasmin, so how has the pandemic impacted Muslim communities in Europe and in Germany specifically?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I am very happy to join this discussion today. Just let me start with some background information about Muslims in Germany, because I think it's important to know the main characteristics of German Islam in order also to understand what happened during the pandemic. The presence of Muslims in Germany is mainly visible since the 1960s, when the so-called guest workers arrived in Germany as a consequence of a labor migration at that time. So then mainly guest workers came from Turkey. They started to self-organize in religious matters and built Islamic congregations, mainly for Muslims coming from the same country, talking the same language. So we had an organizational impetus along the origin countries. And then we had a second immigration wave of Muslims followed in the 1990s in the war of former Yugoslavia, who also started to build own congregations according to their origins in Southeast Europe. And a third wave was just recently with the refugee influx of 2015, which gave the German Islam a more Arabic shape when refugees mainly arrived from Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan. And now we have about 4,700,000 Muslims living in Germany, which is a share of about 6% of the general population. And the German Muslim population is as diverse as the Muslims are worldwide, I would say, coming from more than 50 different countries and with different migration histories. But what is different is that Muslims are more religious compared to the average population. So that means the Muslims are a quite visible community in a quite non-religious context, we must say. So in Germany, we have now around about 2,700 Muslim congregations, mosques. Most of them are organized, as I said before, along the ethnic lines, and they are mostly also part of one of the several Islamic umbrella organizations. And important to know is that the Muslim organizational landscape is not comparable with the hierarchical structure of the church. Muslim organizations in Germany has mainly grown from the bottom to top and still continue to grow. So it has become a very complex and dynamic network, which reflects somehow also decades and history of conflict-laden learning process of both sides of the part of the Muslim minority and of the part of the majority population in Germany. So this, just as a rough summary of the history of Muslims in Germany. So let's come now to the question, what happened during the Corona crisis with the Muslim community and their religious services? So the lockdown in Germany happened right before the start of the holy month of Ramadan, which is characterized mainly by a vivid social life, gatherings in the evenings to eat together, and also by common prayers and a very vivid religious life. So this was quite a challenge. However, the quick adaptation to the situation showed again how flexible these Muslim religious landscape is. So the Muslim communities reacted very quickly, I must say. So the Coordination Council of Muslims in Germany, so this is a top organizational level, I would say, which consists of the 4 largest Islamic umbrella organizations, managed to get a quick consensus on measures against the spread of the virus. And this consensus is far from self-evident, because usually the internal processes of the Coordination Council is very conflict-laden, and it is very difficult to come to common results because there is a lot of competition and tension and so on. But in the Corona crisis, this was different, which was quite a result. And also the distribution of the measures from the top level into the single congregations, the local application of the measures in the single mosques was quite successful all over Germany. So the main measures were to pray at home and to celebrate Ramadan with the core family. All congregations have been closed. And this also led to rethink and also to a reinvention of Islamic traditions. We had virtual prayer and virtual iftar, the daily break of the fast through video and social media, which also enabled the community life in times of social distancing. So our federal president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, also praised Muslims for adhering to the lockdown measures during Ramadan, which not every religious community did in the same way, we must say. And we had also many signs of interreligious solidarity. One example is that about 40 German cities and communities allowed the public muezzin call as a sign of solidarity, and also for moral support as a substitute for a missing communal prayer. But this, again, also led to new conflicts, because not everybody likes to listen to the muezzin call publicly. And according to a survey, 60% of the German population don't want to listen to that. They feel bothered by listening to it. Yeah, this follows also the results we observe in the frame of the Religion Monitor project, where we also conduct many surveys. And I think there is a lot of prejudice and tension in Germany, not only in Germany, I think also in other European countries, when it comes to Islam and the Muslim presence. So far maybe.
Sure. So this is a great introduction to the follow-up questions, and I hope we'll be talking about social cohesion, internal conflicts, and the political implications of all this. But I wanted to start with a very general and maybe strange question, but I think it's important in case our viewers and listeners don't really have a deep knowledge about Islam. Before I move to that, I just want to remind our viewers and listeners that you can ask questions in our 3 media, where we are live streaming this conversation, which is on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So please do ask questions. We'll take them later after we've covered our topics. So I wanted to ask about the dogma, the Islamic dogma. In Christianity, there's a notion of suffering and illness as a cross one needs to carry. And I actually, by way of preparation for this conversation, I noted down what Christian teachings tell us, and Christian scripture tells us about illness. And so it's that suffering produces intimacy with God, that suffering equips us to comfort others, that suffering refines us, produces growth and maturity, that there's this positive element of an illness and suffering in Christianity. So I wonder if either of you, I'm looking at Yasmin, actually, could explain to us what's the attitude of Islam to illness.
Maybe it's important, first of all, to say that Islam is a religion which is not so much on dogma, maybe more on practice. So this is maybe one of the differences among Christianity and Islam. And the observance follows the regulation of the everyday life according to religious rules. And I think also in the pandemic, we have seen that there is a whole history of different rules apart in former times. And there is also some precedents happening when other pandemics happened in former times, when religious authorities tried to apply the sayings of the prophet, for example, how to behave in such a situation. So we find in these texts, which is collected in the hadith, these are the sayings of the prophet, and also the scripture of the religious authorities, for example, that when there is an illness, one should not travel to this country, or one should keep at home. Also, there is a very practical. This is a very practical kind of regulations which already exist from former experience, and which have been applied now by religious authority to the actual situation. And this is also one reason, I would say, why there was such a quick consensus and such a quick behavior in the Muslim community.
Right. Amani, you are of course free to comment on that if you wish, but I wanted to turn to you with a slightly different question and draw you out a little bit about what you said about Muslim communities, because of them being of migrant origin, being on the front lines in fighting the pandemic as medics, but also as people who need to do and provide services for the rest of the society. And I wonder if you find any specifics that really make the Muslim community stand out among other communities, also, you know, of sort of lower social class because of smaller means to go by. Is there any difference? Is there any specificity about how they coped with the pandemic?
Sure, and particularly in the US, a recent survey was done by the Institute of Policy and Understanding in 2018. And in that survey, it found that third of Muslims in the US either live at the poverty line or below the poverty line. And I tried this in preparing for today to look at some statistics, but the US Census Bureau does not ask for religious kind of religious questions. So it's difficult to find that. But we do know, generally speaking, that even the professionals and educated Muslims who are immigrants coming from other places, they do not usually work in their profession, and they end up working on a lower income kind of jobs, even for the doctors and for the professionals. And particularly the Muslim community in the US is for the most part first and second generation kind of communities. Either they were born here or their parents born here. And that also impact how do they experience the US general kind of vulnerabilities. But when it comes to the pandemic now, I have information about the Black African American kind of Muslims, but I couldn't find something specific to Muslims who came from outside the US. For the African American communities, even though they constitute only 13% of the US population.
How much? Sorry, didn't get that.
3.
Mm-hmm.
50%, their COVID infection percentage is 23%, which is really disproportionate with the number of Muslims, even though they are a very small number in comparison to the general US American population. They are at a much higher risk. And that explains to a very large extent why. We know that many of the Muslim immigrants who are in the process of finalizing their immigration paperwork here in the US, those who are in detention centers or who are like violating their visas, they are placed in either jails or detention centers. And these are kind of very concentrated areas with very high COVID infection rates as well. So in many ways, as I said, the experiences vary. Like those who are coming from Middle Eastern countries, from the Gulf country, come with certain resources. They have a different kind of socioeconomic status, and as a result, you find that their infection rates may be relatively lower than those who are here and who are struggling to survive, regardless of their professions. Mm-hmm. So this is one component. But even in comparison with Jewish and other religious groups, since September 11, the Muslims have been really marginalized and have been suffering from different levels of xenophobia and racism and Islamophobia in the US. And the Trump administration has really worsened the situation by its anti-Muslim and kind of Islamophobic policies. And that puts the Muslims at a much also greater kind of disadvantage when it comes to coping and not having the enough community or government resources that enables them to better shoulder the pandemic and all the kind of vulnerabilities that are associated with it. We find certain xenophobia when it comes to Chinese Muslims communities in the US. Just in this weekend, President Trump used, I'm not sure if you heard that in Europe or not, used a racist slur to refer to coronavirus as the Kung flu. And he was cheered by his kind of white supremacist kind of supporters. And that shows you many Asian American Muslims, particularly Chinese, now experience certain level of discrimination and xenophobia, given that the coronavirus originated in China. So again, they are not a homogeneous group, and we find that their experience is really varied based on which community that you assess and evaluate. Mm-hmm. I think there is room for doing more surveys and more studies to kind of have an in-depth and more information. All of these are kind of anecdotal evidence based on my observation and just my reading of the newspapers and the daily kind of situation. We have all been confined as well, which in so many ways restricts our ability to engage in first-hand kind of research and know what is happening with many of these communities. But it has been going on for quite some time, even before September 11, for Muslims who are coming from outside. The situation for African American Muslims started with the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. And they have disproportionately experienced what other African Americans usually experience. And that has been, as you said earlier, has been brought to the forefront after the assassination of George Floyd. But the Muslim American, African American communities are really struggling and suffering at so many levels in the US.
I wonder, a follow-up question, if you were to say if it's a sort of a popular discrimination or if it's a systemic discrimination. I mean, is it about popular attitude among people in the street that you feel in the society when it comes to Chinese Muslims or African American Muslims? Or is it about, no health coverage because of this systemic discrimination that puts you, that this puts a ceiling, a social mobility ceiling over you that pushes you down? Or is it this popular feeling or a combination of both?
It's a combination of both. For African Americans, Muslims, it is for sure systemic kind of racial and religious and different forms of intersecting forms of power relations that put them at the disadvantage, even in comparison with other African American communities. So Muslim African Americans are more disproportionately and more severely experiencing the pandemic in comparison to other African American communities, right? Mm-hmm. So, and this is systemic racism. And I think, like, at least now there is the protest on the street, the Black Lives Matters, shout to them, like, are bringing many of these issues to the surface. And many Americans now are really digging deeper into their souls and having an open conversation about how the 400 years of slavery and the consequences of policies afterwards, how have these impacted African Americans? But when it comes to the other communities, I think their experiences, the xenophobia, the hostility towards some of these Muslim Americans happened after September 11. And these were mainly catered and directed towards those who are coming from the Middle East and Muslim countries. South Asian, Bengali, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from Iran, also experienced it in many ways. We had a project at UMass Boston that did look at the experiences of Muslims in the US before the COVID. And it found that many of the Muslims, the project was done by colleagues of mine, Dr. Ilora Chowdhury and Dr. Rajni Segna. And they discovered that many of the young Muslim women find certain harassment in the subways, for example, or in public transportation. And I'm not sure how systemic that is, but there are so many incidences of Islamophobia that has really intensified now after the Trump administration policy and hostilities towards pitting people against each other and divisive kind of politics. Mm-hmm. So that is very noticeable within the US. Generally speaking, it is magnified now under the corona pandemic atmosphere.
Mm-hmm. So this begs a question to Yasmin about the situation in Germany. Obviously, the German German government has had a very different policy from the Trump administration and has been very careful about the language and the tone when it comes to religious minorities, Muslim minorities specifically. And here I mean this address by Steinmeier to at the end of Ramadan, I think he just occasionally puts out those addresses to Muslims. But I wonder what the German policy is vis-a-vis Muslims, and if you were to, because you're doing the surveys and in Religion Monitor you measure the pulse of the German society, if there are any shifts in attitudes towards Muslims in Germany.
I mean, we didn't do the survey now during the coronavirus, so I think we will see if there's any effect of the coronavirus pandemic maybe later. But when we look at the former surveys, we can say that we have quite a paradoxical situation in Germany. I think we can say that many Germany's Muslims are quite open from their attitudes because we always survey both sides. But on the other side, there's an increasing animosity toward them on the part of the majority populations. So that means that Muslims suffer somehow from a negative image, which is for sure also shaped by the debates and discussions we had in the last 20 years, which were shaped mostly by the small minority of extremists who are just a small number. When we look at the numbers, we only less than 1% of the Muslim population can be judged as extremists, but the media focus on these topics, on these problematic aspects, had also an impact on these biased perception Muslims in Germany, but also in whole Europe, I would say. One indicator for this is that the share of Muslims is always greatly overestimated. In Germany, for instance, the people think that more than 1/5 of the population is Muslim, but in reality, only 1 of 20 is a Muslim. And this overestimation we find also in other European countries. So this is very symptomatic, I would say, for how prejudiced is the perception of Muslims. And the religion monitor from the Bertelsmann Stiftung show that there is a stable negative perception of Muslims since 10 years now. This is the time we are conducting this survey, maybe it's longer. And so every second German perceives Islam as a threat, and also a same share think that Islam does not fit to the Western world. So there is a huge gap between perception and reality. And one of the most absurd results came from a survey which I saw recently in the UK, which also was conducted just now during the pandemic. And it shows that the share of 20% of the population think that Muslims brought the virus in order to destroy Western values. So I think in times of crisis, tensions will even rise. So this is the one side of the perception side. I'm not sure how does this affect also the systematic structural discrimination. I mean, the German health system is different, I would say, from the US health system, because here everybody has an insurance, everybody has the right for medical treatment. And I think this is really, I wouldn't say that there is a kind of discrimination on that level. But if you look at the community level, for example, when you look at the Muslim congregations, so we must say they have not a stable financial basis. I mean, when you look at the other religious communities, the churches, for example, have a quite safe financial basis because they are funded mostly by taxes, and thus the shutdown for sure had a much stronger impact on the Muslim congregation, because they rely on donation and voluntary engagement. And many mosques fear they won't be able to pay their rents, the bills, the salary for the imams, and so on. This is really an existential situation for many mosque communities. I mean, the state does not finance religious institutions. It is a secular state, but I think some mosques received money in the frame of a general aid system during the pandemic, but I'm not sure if that was enough. I mean, I could tell some words about the about the state-religion relationship in Germany. If this is maybe this could be also interesting, because this is also different from US, I guess. The German state has to adhere to the principle of state neutrality, which means that the state in general neither allowed to favor nor to discriminate against certain confessions, and cannot define what constitutes a religion or a religious behavior. On the other hand, the basic law does not establish a strict separation, but a cooperation between the state and the religious societies. For example, it allows religious classes as part of the regular curriculum in public schools, the establishment of private denominational schools, and so on. But to become a religious community, to be accepted as a legal body, religious communities has to fulfill certain conditions. And this form of cooperation is tailored to the Christian churches and their hierarchical organizational structure, but this church-like structure is not part of Islam, and this is why most religious Muslim communities are not accepted as religious communities by law. So and this is a completely different situation compared to the situation of the churches.
Mm-hmm. So you're talking about the legal basis for relations between denominations and the state, whereas there's also this sort of narrative level where politicians simply set the tone or give an example. And here I think it's this major difference between the US today and Germany. So if I were to ask you just a follow-up question, Yasmin, about this current Merkel government's attitude now to the Muslim minority, is there anything specific that you can you describe somehow this policy vis-a-vis Muslims?
I mean, I think there is a real interest in including Muslim communities into the society. I mean, there is the German Islam Conference is set up 2005, and this is a dialogue platform in order to find a solution how to be able to cooperate also with Muslim communities. This is not always very fruitful, but it tells us that there is a kind of will. So there is a will to do something, and this is, I think, maybe a different attitude, even if it's not always successful, and even sometimes some behavior also led to rise even tension between the Muslim and non-Muslim communities. Sometimes they push to some institutional developments without talking to the general population. Then there was quite a tension. Why appear now a mosque which is visible at a mosque? We don't want to have that. And so it was. There is a goodwill, I would say, but so also a lot of harm had happened. And we must also say we have now the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, in our parliament, which is also playing with these tensions, I would say. They know that there is a deep skeptical perception of Islam and Muslims in the general population, and they try to trigger these kind of anxiety, and this is also quite a difficult situation, I would say.
Mm-hmm. I have a question that a colleague of mine asked me to ask, which is if there is a specific role for women, for Muslim women in maybe not in the pandemic, but maybe in terms of the social cohesion between Muslims and other religious communities. This is a question to both of you. Maybe Amani, would you like to start?
Sure. And we find that like Muslim women in the US, as well as women generally, and Muslim women in other parts of the world, they do shelter the burden of assuming their gender kind of roles and responsibilities, especially during the pandemic, where women are expected to care for the sick, to care for the elderly, and to perform some of these kind of roles that sometimes put them at physical or emotional kind of risks. Many women and Muslim women in the US nowadays are dealing with the challenge of homeschooling their children and trying to figure out how to do this virtual online learning for their children.
So can I just intersect here to ask about religion classes? That I know what they're like in Egypt, for example, where I've done research, and normally there would be a person coming home to teach the kids, or they would be sent, or they would have religion classes at school. But I wonder if there's anything specific there in with religion classes now in the pandemic.
I think like regular schooling as well as religious Quran teaching and memorizing, it's all now on the shoulder of women and trying to figure that out while taking care of the family, taking care of the sick, and being confined within their household. So my assumption is that now women have to do Quranic and Islamic teaching as part of their stuff. I'm not sure to what extent are men engaged in that aspect of children, kind of caring for children and following up on the schooling of children. It varies from family to family, and it varies, like there is no kind of consistent way of looking at how all Muslim communities in the US deal with that. But women experience gender violence, and particularly now all these people are forced to live in small spaces and being confined in that same space for now going to 4 months. And that drives some of the Muslim women crazy, that they have to deal with the children and they have to deal with the husbands who are now present all day and night, and and there are certain incidences of different forms of domestic violence, emotional or physical or otherwise, that is perpetrated against women. And this is true in the US and true in other parts of the globe, I think as well. But it's not just gender. I think age as well. The elderly are now those who are more disproportionately impacted and die at a kind of larger number as a result of the COVID pandemic. Sexuality, LGBTQ communities in the US and elsewhere are also disproportionately impacted. So when we look at gender and women, it's part of this whole web of kind of correlations that let individuals experience the pandemic in distinct and kind of very particular, sometimes negative ways.
Mm-hmm. Yasmin, the same question to you. Although, you know, we have in Poland a lot of talk about this increase in domestic violence because of the quarantines and being made to stay home. But I wonder, like, without falling into this trap of stereotyping a Muslim woman who, you know, she much more than other women is responsible for the house or doesn't work, or I don't know. Can you unpack this for us more?
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. I mean, women are suffering in this situation more than others, I'm sure, in terms of homeschooling, in terms of responsibility for the elderly, and so on. But I would say also we have it in Germany that the domestic violence is rising, but I'm not sure if this is a problem, an issue of religion. And what I have seen is that this is more an issue of social class, of social inequality, that there are certain milieus where women are much more, where it's being assumed that they are much more affected from the situation. But I don't think that this is a kind of religion. But I must say, I mean, still, the Muslim population in Germany is disadvantaged. They are more in the lower levels of education or in the labor market, even when it's getting better from generation to generation still. And this is the kind of milieu maybe where the lower educated or some disadvantaged neighborhoods where we have more of this. But I wouldn't say that this is a kind of religion, but maybe now in the pandemic, it is also a kind of, I'm sure there are also different psychological aspects, because I also heard about that this is also not a long income or something, but it can happen in every family. So we have to be aware of this, not only to look at certain population groups maybe. And I mean, we have this discussion always, Muslim women have to discuss these issues and are in the focus of the debates, oppressing of women, headscarf and so on. And now I have the impression in Germany, the focus is changing to a different perspective. We are not discussing so much about Muslims anymore because there are other problems which are more important. This is on the one hand side, this is maybe good to be not too focused on the Muslim minority, but on the other side, maybe also the problems and issues which still have to think about and which still have to solve, maybe also are away from the agenda, maybe. So there's also a danger in this, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So we have 10 minutes left, and a question that's come up here is, what are internal and international policy implications from the pandemic in terms of Muslim integration in the US and Europe? Are there any political conclusions that you can draw from the situation that Muslims found themselves in Europe and the US? Amani?
So the US, and I really think that the current political climate in the US is not a broader reflective of mainstream US policies. We are under a really kind of unique administration these days. And in many ways, picking fights with European allies, discrediting the World Health Organization, cutting funds to the World Health Organization in the midst of the pandemic. We're like, and I think this is a kind of an opinion of many Americans who cannot wait for the November elections to somehow steer America back to the company of the international communities and take the lead in some of these other aspects. So in terms of political, it's difficult to anticipate in terms of what are the kind of political points that we can draw from the U.S. responses to the pandemic nowadays, even locally or at the global level. I think internally, I can say more about that in a sense that there are many different Muslim communities, that there is a National Black Muslim COVID Coalition, there is the Muslim Anti-Racist Collaborative, there is the Muslim Wellness Foundation. Many of these foundations join forces together and are trying to step in nowadays to provide certain kind of services and help and guidance, particularly for the Muslim communities in terms of how to navigate and how to connect with other kind of social movements to kind of improve people experiences and just give them some kind of guidance, because as of right now, we are missing that kind of national guidance and leadership that assure and unite people and provide any kind of hopeful alternatives. So the US in this peculiar and kind of weird position right now. So I as I said, combined with the protests, combined with the broader social movements that are happening now, and the demonstrations that are happening in all 50 states within the US as we speak right now, there is kind of hope for grassroots, bottom-up kind of coalition buildings to address some of the issues and to bring people together. And I think this is one of the positive aspects of maybe disasters, that it brings people together and try to work for sustainable changes that will improve not only the situation of Muslim populations in the US, but all populations in the US and around the globe. But maybe Yasmin will have more stuff to talk about international policy in the context of Germany or Europe.
I wonder, I'm not sure if you followed the Biden campaign to the extent to know that, but so has he a plan? Does he have a plan? Is it present in his rhetoric, the issue of social cohesion, the attitude to minorities, maybe to Muslims specifically?
Yeah. So Biden is positioning himself as a presidential candidate in contrast to Trump, in a sense that his main message is that he is fighting for the soul of America and restoring America's kind of dignity locally, nationally, and internationally. And we are in the midst of a political campaign. And in campaigns, we know that many leaders will make all kinds of promises to different communities in order to consolidate their support for the specific candidate. So taking that with a grain of salt, I know that Biden has reached to all different communities. He was very central as part of this Black Lives Matter movements and reaching out to Muslim communities and to all different communities within the US. But it is still part of that kind of campaign mood, and whether or not this will be materialized if he got elected in November, that remains to be seen.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yasmin, so the same question about political implications for the integration of Muslims in Europe, but also, I don't know, maybe more broadly. And there's also this concept that everyone's interested in, the European Islam. I mean, some kind of an Islam that's sort of specific to Europe. I wonder what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, we have been discussing, or we have been having this theoretical discussion about the question how Islam should be shaped to be compatible with the European values. But this is, I would say, more a theoretical discussion based on certain perceptions of what Islam looks like. As I said before, we have a really prejudiced perception of Islam as a static, unflexible religion, which is also mirrored by several surveys. But from an empirical point of view, I would say Islam has long been on the way to Europeanization. Muslims have found independent way how to deal with their religion in a non-religious atmosphere. There is also more unobserved from the public. There has been established a Muslim civil society across whole Europe, and they demand to participate. So I'm not sure if the Corona crisis had an effect on that development concerning European Islam, but the way I would say how the Muslim communities behaved, how they adapted very quickly to the situation and applied the measures, showing again that Muslims are already part of Europe, who are already taking responsibility for their countries they live in, and who also help to manage the crisis. And only the consciousness about that would already help to establish an European Islam. Important to say is also that European Islam does not mean that Islam is limited to the European borders, how many people perceive it. As other world religions, Islam is also a world religion, and Muslims in Germany and the European countries are still connected to their countries of origin. And this is always seen as a problem, but I would say this is also a chance, because in a more and more global world, we need bridge builders with such a hybrid orientation towards both the host society on the one side and the society of origin on the other side. So let's come to the political implications. What does that mean for politics? I think so we should more look at the chances and not so much at the problems. Sure, there are still problems. There's still a lot to do in terms of integration, in terms of other things too. But there are also many chances and possibilities, not only for the Muslim communities, but also for Europe as a whole, in terms of learning from each other, but also in terms of possibilities to cooperate on the level of civil society, but also on the institutional level. So therefore, we need to act actively against anti-Muslim racism. I know that not many politicians do that, because you can't win elections with this with this topic. But I think it's important to also show the chances. First of all, it is important to promote mutual contact between Muslims and adherents of other denominations, especially also with the non-religious part of the population. religion monitor show how important the personal contact is in order to overcome prejudice and also foster mutual acceptance. But also politicians have the responsibility to promote the vision of Europe as a diverse continent where also Islam is part of Europe. There's needed more religious literacy, there is needed more cultural sensitivity. And I mean, Federica Mogherini is trying that, or has been trying that. She has a vision of that, I would say. And I mean, there's more a positive perception. I mean, the European Islam we can be proud of because where we have this kind of diversity in Islam in other parts of the world, where it can develop in a climate of religious freedom. This is more or less unique in the world, I would say, and I would wish that we would be more proud of this and to see this as a chance and not as a problem.
Right. What a great note to end on. But before we do this, I just want to underline a couple of points that transpired from your remarks today, which I think are important. Your last note, yes, mean that the more personal contact we have, the less prejudiced we are. It's also visible in the surveys that we have had in Poland for the past 20 years. Every year, the main polling house in Poland does survey about our attitude to foreigners. And this attitude changes the more contact a person has with that kind of ethnicity or religious minority, the less prejudiced Poles become. And this is visible throughout, across the board, in all, vis-a-vis all ethnicities and all religions. So the points that I wanted to draw is maybe that one about the personal contact, but also about the heterogeneity of this of Muslims and the plasticity of religion, this practical aspect of it versus the dogmatic one, but also this disproportionate experience of the pandemic, in the sense that we're talking about vulnerable groups that are somewhere on the lowest level of the social ladder, and just because of being in this low class, sort of lower social class, they are exposed disproportionately negatively to the crises such as the pandemic. But I also think that there's this one specificity that you mentioned, both of you mentioned in passing, which is that at times of crises, where generally in the population a kind of angst and uncertainty develops, right? This existential threat is somewhere hovering above our heads. We tend to look for victims and tend to look for scapegoats. And my only worry is that Muslims might be the scapegoat with yet another terrorist attack. And the rhetoric, the political rhetoric can change easily, but let's hope that will not happen. And we're taking your word, Amani, for the fact that for what you said about the Trump administration, that it's not a regular administration, not a mainstream US administration. So we'll see what happens in November. But just by way of a conclusion, I wanted to thank you very much, both of you. And I really hope this is not our last meeting. Perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about other aspects of religion, state policy, which is already a theme in scholarly literature, and about state-religion relations, which we, I think, in Europe sometimes shy away from and don't want to touch the topic of religion, but it is so very important socially and politically. So thank you very much, Yasmin and Amani, and thanks to our viewers for watching. And please tune in for next seminars by the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay.